Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so welcome to our deep dives. Today we're going to kind of uncover this fascinating chapter in Canadian history and really kind of get into how Canada went from, I don't know, kind of a quiet player on the world stage to, actively championing this whole global engagement thing right after World War II.
Yeah, and it's a story with some twists and turns, and it's one that I think a lot of people might not know the full scope of.
Yeah, and I think, the spoiler alert here is it all starts with, this real-life spy thriller.
Oh, okay.
And it's...
That would make James Bond jealous, for sure.
Totally. Yeah.
We're talking about the Gouzenko Affair, 1946.
Gouzenko Affair.
A moment that just shook Canada to its core and really set the stage for this pretty dramatic shift in its foreign policy.
Okay, so set the scene for me, what actually happened?
So picture this, right?
Yeah.
The world is just catching its breath after World War II.
Yeah.
And you've got this seemingly ordinary Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Gazenko. He's working in Canada, and he decides to defect. But he doesn't come empty-handed. He brings with him, a whole trove of documents that expose this massive Soviet spy ring operating right under everyone's noses in Canada.
Hold on. Soviet spy ring in Canada, everyone was freaking out.
Absolutely. It was a bombshell, right? It kind of shattered the sense of security that Canada had. They'd been relatively sheltered from these kinds of international power struggles.
Almost it's like a wake-up call.
Exactly, a wake-up call.
Okay.
And it forced them to rethink their entire approach to global affairs.
Okay, so this is all happening, and as this is happening, a new figure kind of walks onto the scene.
Yes.
And that is Louis St-Laurent.
That's right, Louis St-Laurent.
He kind of steps up and becomes Secretary of State for External Affairs in 1946.
Yep.
So he steps into this role, and he is basically tasked with figuring out how does Canada navigate this whole new world order, especially with the Cold War looming.
Right, and he realizes that the old way of doing things, where Prime Minister Mackenzie King would just kind of personally manage foreign affairs, that wasn't going to cut it anymore. They needed a more strategic, more proactive approach, and that's where the United Nations comes in.
Okay, so the UN, this is more than just Canada joining a peacekeeping organization.
Oh, way more than that.
Okay,
St-Laurent, he saw the UN as a platform, a way for Canada to project its values, assert its independence, and really start punching above its weight on the world stage.
When you say, punching above its weight, it makes me think about how sometimes smaller countries can have this, outsized impact on global affairs.
Absolutely. He understood that in this new multilateral world, which just means working together with lots of other countries.
Yeah.
A middle power like Canada could actually wield a lot of influence.
Okay.
And the UN provided this forum where they could have a voice and help shape solutions.
Okay, so we have got this backdrop of the Cold War and this growing realization that Canada needs to step up its game on the international stage.
Yeah.
But how does that actually, translate into action?
Well, that's where a new idea begins to take root, something we now call Pearsonian internationalism.
Oh, yeah, Pearsonian internationalism, named after Lester B. Pearson, who, later becomes prime minister.
Yes.
He wins a Nobel Peace Prize for this whole idea.
He does. Yeah. And that's the thing about Pearsonian internationalism. Yeah. It wasn't just some, feel-good idea. It was a strategy that gave Canada a ton of influence on the world stage.
Okay.
And you see this play out in the Suez Crisis in 1956.
So remind me, what was the Suez Crisis all about? And how did Pearson, how did this internationalism thing play into it?
All right, so the Suez Crisis was a major international conflict involving Egypt, Israel, France, and Britain.
Okay.
It was a real powder keg. And the world was on edge, fearing that it could escalate into a larger war.
Okay, so high stakes. Lots of tension.
Lots of tension.
Canada steps in.
That's right. Pearson, who was at the time Secretary of State for External Affairs, comes up with this really bold plan to create a neutral peacekeeping force under the UN umbrella.
And that's where he gets the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
So he's like a diplomatic superhero preventing World War III.
Pretty much. His efforts to just defuse the situation earned him international acclaim and really solidified Canada's reputation as a peacekeeping nation. Sure. But it also proved that Pearsonian internationalism, this blend of collective security, mediation, and promoting those liberal democratic values, it could actually work.
So it wasn't just talk.
Yeah.
It was a real, tangible demonstration of Canada's commitment to a different kind of foreign policy.
Exactly.
One rooted in diplomacy and cooperation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when you think about it, Canada kind of historically was a little hesitant on the global stage, but then they kind of step up and become this key player in resolving this major international crisis. It's a real coming-of-age moment.
You know, you're really echoing the words of historian Robert Mothwell, who described this era as Canada's coming of age in foreign policy. It's an apt description, you know, for a nation that really in a short period of time redefined its place in the world, transitioning from, you know, this more isolationist stance to one of active global engagement.
So we've got spies, a shifting world order, and a nation finding its footing. It's a lot to unpack. But there's another layer to this story, right? This is all happening against the backdrop of the Cold War.
Oh, absolutely.
Which must have added a whole other level of complexity to Canada's decision-making.
Oh, yeah. The Cold War definitely cast a long shadow over everything.
Yeah.
And for Canada, you know, it meant walking this incredibly delicate tightrope.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they're embracing the UN, they're pushing for peace and diplomacy, but then on the other hand, they've got this stark reminder of the Soviet threat, you know, thanks to Gazenko.
Right.
So how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, it seems kind of contradictory, right? You're working toward peace, but you're also, like, gearing up for a potential conflict.
Exactly. And it forced Canada to make some really tough choices. And remember how we talked about that balancing act? Well, NATO was a big part of that. You know, it was like Canada hedging its bets just in case things with the Soviets went south.
Hold on. So Canada's pushing for peace at the UN, but also joining a military alliance.
Yeah, it might seem counterintuitive, but in 1949, Canada becomes a founding member of NATO, you know, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Right.
Basically, it was a defensive alliance to counter Soviet aggression in Europe.
Yep.
And for Canada, it was a way of saying, look, we're committed to peace, but we're also prepared to defend ourselves and our allies.
So it's like they're trying to deter conflict through strength in numbers.
Yeah.
But still hoping to achieve peace through diplomacy at the UN.
Exactly. It was a nuanced approach, for sure, reflecting the complexities of that era. And, you know, Canada wasn't alone in this balancing act. A lot of Western nations were grappling with that same dilemma.
Yeah, trying to reconcile idealism with the reality of a world that could, you know, erupt in conflict at any moment.
Absolutely. It's interesting how these historical events sometimes mirror the challenges we see today.
Totally.
You know, that whole struggle to find the right balance between diplomacy and defense, it's something that nations are still dealing with.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, we've got these different perspectives on Canada's role in the world, but how did those different schools of thought view, like, whether Canada's balancing act was actually successful? What were their takes on that?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because, you know, each perspective offers a different interpretation of Canada's achievements and also its shortcomings during this time.
Okay, so give me the rundown. How did each school of thought see Canada's performance on that world stage?
All right, so first you've got the Liberal Internationalists.
Okay.
And they're the ones who really champion that whole Pearsonian internationalism approach. They see Canada's actions as like a genuine effort to promote peace and global cooperation through institutions like the UN.
Yeah.
For them, it's about prioritizing diplomacy, upholding those liberal democratic values, and leading by example on the world stage.
So for them, it's about Canada putting those ideals into action.
Precisely. Then you have the realists, who take a more, well, I guess you could say, pragmatic view.
Okay.
They argue that, sure, Canada might have talked a big game about idealism, but ultimately their actions were driven by self-interest and the need to protect their own security, especially with that Soviet threat looming so large.
Right. So the realists are saying it's less about altruism and more about, like, strategic self-preservation.
Exactly. It's realpolitik in action. And then you have the New Left perspective, which is a bit more critical of Canada's relationship with the U.S., especially through NATO.
Right.
They argue that, despite all the talk about multilateralism, Canada's foreign policy was a little too influenced by American interests, particularly during the Cold War.
So the New Left kind of sees Canada as maybe being a little too eager to follow the American lead.
Right. They raise some valid questions about whether Canada was really charting its own course or just falling in line with a more powerful ally. And then lastly, you have the post-revisionist school, which tries to find kind of a middle ground between those other views. They see Canada's foreign policy as a blend of idealism and pragmatism, acknowledging both the desire to contribute to global peace and the need to respond to, those Cold War power dynamics.
So they're basically saying, look, it's not a black and white situation.
Right.
It's more about, like, understanding all those different factors at play.
Exactly. And they argue that you can't just look at one side of the coin. You have to consider both those idealistic aspirations and the very real pragmatic realities that were in play back then.
It's interesting how those different perspectives can paint such contrasting pictures of the same historical period.
It really highlights the importance of considering multiple viewpoints and grappling with the fact that the past is complex.
Totally. So I guess the question is, if we look back at this period through the lens of those 4 different schools of thought, how do they assess whether Canada's balancing act, was ultimately a success?
Well, that's a great question. I think the biggest takeaway here is that history, it rarely offers those, easy answers or simple judgments. When we look back at Canada's journey after the war, we see this nation grappling with some really big questions. And honestly, they're questions that we are still asking today.
Yeah, like what?
Well, how do you balance idealism with, the realities of power politics? How do you promote peace when you're also preparing for potential conflict? And how do you assert your independence while also cooperating with your allies?
Yeah, those are tough questions, right?
They are tough questions, and those are questions that every nation, big or small, has to kind of wrestle with.
It makes you think about, everything we've talked about. Knowing what we know now, how the Cold War played out, how the UN evolved, like, was Canada's approach, was it ultimately successful?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer, no definitive verdict. It really depends on what lens you're using, what perspective you find most compelling.
Right. So, okay, if I'm a liberal internationalist, I'm probably feeling pretty good about Canada's track record.
Yeah, you'd probably point to Canada's leadership role in peacekeeping and their contributions to the UN, and of course their commitment to diplomacy. That's all evidence of a, principled and effective foreign policy.
But if I'm coming at it from that realist perspective, I might be a little more skeptical.
You might be. You might question whether Canada's actions were really driven by idealism or was self-interest playing a bigger role. You might look at their decision to join NATO and say, see, they were more concerned with security and aligning with the U.S. than they were with actually promoting world peace.
And what about the New Left?
Oh, the New Left. They'd be the harshest critics, for sure. They would say that Canada was too quick to just fall in line with American foreign policy and that they missed opportunities to, challenge the status quo, really push for a more just and equitable world order.
So for them, they're focusing on what could have been.
Yeah, what could have been.
Right. Okay. And then we've got the post-revisionists.
Right. The post-revisionists, they're trying to find that middle ground.
Yeah.
They'd probably say, there were achievements, but there are also shortcomings.
Yeah.
They'd emphasize how complex everything was back then and how, idealism and pragmatism were always in tension.
Yeah.
They'd say that Canada's legacy, well, it's a mixed bag, but it's one that offers us some really valuable lessons, I think, for navigating these, challenges of international relations.
So, okay, we've gone through all these perspectives, and it sounds like there is no simple answer to the question of whether Canada's, post-war balancing act, whether it was successful or not. It depends how you see it and how you weigh those different factors.
That's exactly right. And that's the beauty of studying history, I think. It's not about finding the right answer. It's about wrestling with complexity and looking at things from different perspectives and using that to try to understand the past.
And I think we've done a pretty good job of that today, right?
I think so.
We've uncovered this really pivotal chapter in Canada's history. We've seen how they grappled with this rapidly changing world order and how they embraced these new ideas and tried to find their place on the global stage.
Yeah.
It's a story of spies. It's a story of idealism and pragmatism.
Absolutely.
And balancing acts and tough choices. And honestly, it's a story that continues to resonate, I think, even today.
It really does. If you're interested in going deeper into this period, I highly recommend checking out Robert Bothwell's work on Canadian foreign policy.
And for those of you wanting to explore Canada's role in the UN, you should definitely check out the Mr. Hutchings History podcast.
Yeah, they've got a great episode on that topic.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic resource if you want to delve deeper into this really pivotal moment in Canadian history.
Yeah, for sure.
So there you have it. A nation transformed, a world in flux, and a legacy that continues to shape global affairs to this day. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time as we explore another fascinating chapter in history.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.